All right, looks like we're good to go. All right, so good afternoon. I'm Allison Lester, the Associate Director of Visitor and Member Engagement, and I'm coming to you live from the Heard Museum. I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual art talk, Leon Polk Smith and the Sexuality of Abstraction with Dr. Jonathan Katz. I'll go over a few housekeeping items first. Today's event is a webinar, which means you'll only see and hear from our panelists. The chat box is always open. Just make sure you select everyone if you would like your comments to be seen by more than just me and the panelists, or if you are having some technical difficulties, you can just select panelists only. At the very end of the discussion, we'll have a Q&A. You're welcome to submit your questions at any time. You can put them in the comments, you can put them in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can always call the membership helpline. I'm going to drop that as the first comment in the chat. And again, we'll have a brief survey for you at the conclusion of the event. Those have been so great for us to help plan future virtual art talks. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel in about a week. So today's discussion and Q&A will be moderated by our Fine Arts Curator, Erin Joyce. So without further delay, I'll turn this over to Erin, who will introduce Dr. Katz, and I'll see everyone again at the end of the virtual art talk.
I just realized I was on mute. Sorry, you didn't hear any of that. It's my privilege today to welcome our guest, Dr. Jonathan Katz. Katz is an art historian, curator, and queer activist, now associate professor of practice in the history of art and interim director of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Katz is a pioneering figure in the development of a queer art history and the author of a number of books and articles. He co-curated Hide and Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, the first queer art exhibition ever mounted at a major US museum, which opened at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery and then traveled to the Brooklyn and Tacoma museums, winning the Best National Museum Exhibition Award from the International Association of Art Critics and the Best LGBTQ Nonfiction Book Award from the American Library Association. His major exhibition, Art AIDS in America, traveled to 5 museums across the US. The first full-time American academic to be tenured in a program he founded in what was called the Lesbian and Gay Studies, Katz was also the founding director of the Yale University's Larry Kramer Initiative in Lesbian and Gay Studies, and the first in the Ivy League. An activist academic, he has founded the Queer Caucus for Art of the College Art Association. The Professional Association of Artists and Art Historians co-founded the Queer Nation San Francisco and founded the Gay and Lesbian Town Meeting, the organization that successfully lobbied for queer anti-discrimination statutes in the city of Chicago in the 1980s. He was over 40 before his publication record came to eclipse his arrest record. That's very interesting. He is the president emeritus of the new Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York City, where he curated numerous exhibitions. As a scholar of modern and contemporary art, Katz is responsible for many of the first queer studies of such defining artists as Georgia O'Keeffe, Jasper Johns, Leon Polk Smith, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, Richard Hamilton, Yayoi Kusama, Cy Twombly, Agnes Martin, Robert Indiana, and a number of others. Katz is now completing 2 new books, Hiding in Plain Sight on the Queerness of Contemporary Art, and The Silent Camp, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and the Cold War. He is also the editor of the forthcoming Routledge Companion of Queer Art History. He has curated the exhibition About Face, Stonewall, Revolt, and the New Queer Art in the summer of 2019 at the Wrightwood 659, and a new museum in Chicago. The largest queer art exhibition ever mounted, featuring some 500 works. It will be available as a book in late 2021. He is currently curating a major international exhibition called The First Homosexuals, a global show of the very first representations of sexual difference after coining the term homosexual in 1869, accompanied by a book of the same name. He is also the beneficiary of a major Mellon Foundation grant, organizing 14 exhibitions and performance in Latin America on the theme of contemporary and historical dispossession. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Katz, who will be sharing with us about Leon Polk Smith and his sexual abstraction.
Thank you very much, Erin. And if I might, let me show my screen so we can begin. Oops, that's not it. There it is. Well, if it wasn't art history, if it wasn't technical difficulty, it wouldn't be art history. There we go. Okay. So I want to show you a very early work by Leon Polk Smith at a moment when his career as an artist is just beginning. Barnyard, 1938. Because it inaugurates what I'm going to be arguing is one of the through threads of Leon Polk Smith's career, which is an intense interest in, as he put it, both sides of the line. What's striking about this work is the degree to which it invokes both concave and convex lines of force. Everywhere, right? The cow's ribs become, right, a space in which, as you can see here, right, this cow's, this cow's, if I can get my pointer, this cow's head is interjected into this cow's body. Likewise, elsewhere, throughout, one has this sort of play with udder and phallus, with udder and sun. Everything seems to be both itself and something else. And one gets the sense that what Polk Smith is doing here is sort of exploiting the possibilities of linearity to animate both sides of a line. And you can see that even more clearly here in a year later in Bicyclists in Georgia, where there's a kind of conglomeration of body and bicycle that's almost, indissoluble. You can't figure out where body ends and bike begins. And as his thinking progresses, we see here, right, an image in which line becomes both itself and, as it were, its neighbor. Everything is defined both as in terms of both positive and negative space. So the black form, of course, also is defined by this green form, and the two of them exist in symbiosis. Eventually, by 1943, Polk Smith is almost eliminating the image entirely, but he finds that a relatively sort of blocked solution. It doesn't allow him much leeway. And so his real breakthrough image is this one. And it's a breakthrough image precisely because effectively, number one, this is a picture that could extend, as it were, into infinity. There's no necessary reason that the canvas ends the way it does. But more than that, the question is, are we looking at black forms on red, or are we looking at red forms on black? And the fact that we can't tell which it is of course exactly the point. That's what I'm trying to say Polk Smith is doing. Now, up until this moment, these are formal considerations. These are ideas about art and form. But in 1954, in looking at a sporting goods catalog that was sent through the mail, he came across a drawing of a baseball. And with that drawing of a baseball, he realized that one of the great possibilities inherent in draftsmanship was the ability to create what he called, right, this third space, which is to say the impression of volume in the flat medium of drawing. And I want to argue, and this is central, that at this moment, as he's looking at that sporting goods catalog drawing of a ball, it's not just the volumetricity of the ball, the fact that it's a three-dimensional object in its depiction here that matters, The other thing that matters, and it's of key import to him for the rest of his career, is that he comes to realize that this can stand in for forms of embodiment, for forms specifically of male embodiment, and not to put too fine a point on it, for phallic embodiment. He comes to realize as a gay man that he can encode forms of gay meaning, gay desire in abstract imagery that wouldn't be detectable at a social historical moment when gay people were quite literally, right, losing jobs and often lives to persistent homophobia. The 1950s, of course, witnessing perhaps the greatest level of homophobia the United States had ever experienced. And so very quickly, he starts to play with these phallic images, this play between positive and negative space, this play between both sides of the line, in order to suggest forms of male embodiment that would be, he felt, legible only to those who were so inclined to read it as he did. And you can see the centrality of that first image, because the second image he made in its wake is called After First One. So he really starts to think this through. And again, he begins to exploit this ball, this three-dimensionality, and the idea of phallic or embodied possibility. Not always phallic, as here, right, it suggests what, maybe, buttocks in a bathing suit. But he is thinking through this form specifically in terms of embodiment. And then he comes to realize, as here, that he doesn't necessarily need to suggest the body, to represent the body, in order to suggest these forms of embodiment, precisely because, as here, two like forms, touching, pulling away from each other, seem to suggest a kind of mini drama of the idea of connection, of touch, of eros and sexuality that doesn't necessarily turn on the figuration of an actual body, phallic or otherwise. And so in these works, and here he starts to exploit specifically the medium of collage. This is a paper cutout. What Polk Smith is digging into is this idea of interpenetration, of both sides of the line that he had been interested in from the very beginning, but now that formal interest is married to an interest in sexuality and an interest in identity. Here, right, gayness figured in the most abstract of all ways, simply as two like forms interpenetrating. Sometimes those forms assume a phallic sort of outline, but by no means always. And what consistently animates Polk's early work at this moment is this idea of one form and another form in absolutely inherent and necessary communion. In other words, as here, you cannot have one form without the other. They each describe one another. They are necessary to one another. Absent one, the other one doesn't exist. So, as an analog of gay life, of two forms in connection, what Polk Smith seems to be suggesting here is the absolute necessity of community, of connection. Here's a perfect example of what I'm suggesting. What is the black without the yellow, right? The two of them define the form. There isn't an inherent singular form. And sometimes, as here, the forms are distinctly not phallic, but much more, right, in terms of the codes of embodiment, much more feminine than masculine. One thing that we've lost in our histories of Polk Smith is how this was recognized very, very early on. He quoted in an interview in the 1960s very positively the fact that one of his collectors referred to his painting as erotic. He quoted her noting that one of the paintings she had dubbed angel buttocks because she felt they were angelically beautiful buttocks. So we now look at hard edge abstraction, as the name would suggest, as a purely abstract, purely formal mode of art making in which the investigation of line and edge is only about line and edge. But early on, it was seen for what I'm arguing it is, which is an analog for human embodiment. And throughout these works, as you can see, one of the defining tropes that he develops again and again is two identical or like forms in some form of communion. A mode, I'm arguing, for representing same-sex desire in a way that would be unreadable to dominant culture under its very nose. So this is a way to talk about his gayness, and he was openly gay, in a way that a culture that was so insistently homophobic simply couldn't read. And as you can see here, one of the striking aspects of these works is that as he develops over time, here we're looking, of course, 1968, so roughly 14 years after the first sort of baseball-informed image, what Polk Smith is doing is he's taking this idea of a kind of quasi-embodiment and pushing it further. So exactly like that pair of sort of swim trunks I suggested earlier, now we have, again, the possibility of someone wearing some form of bathing suit or underwear or something in which, right, their legs emerge from the clothing covering the rest of them in some form of connection, but all done at the level of analogy. And the great thing about analogy is that you can always say to someone who points it out, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. That's obviously your desire speaking, not mine. So it has an inbuilt, right, form of safety in which any recognition of untoward queerness is inherently a product of the viewer's cognition, not of the artist's intention. At its most pure, as here, one has these, again, mini dramas of connection, of like with like, in a way that evades the terms then understood as animating sexuality and especially homosexuality. So it offered a way to articulate desire, again, without any kind of limit, political, social, cultural. And in Rhyme, in 1968, we can see how clearly these forms of connection animate his interest in, right, connection, eroticism, embodiment. Even the choice, right, of the colored paper is not incidental here, as, of course, is too the term rhyme. this idea of two forms of like, right, imitating one another. And I want to suggest here that in this regard, Polk Smith's sexuality, in essence, develops and articulates for the very first time the field of what would become hard-edged abstraction. And the reason that that's important is twofold. Number one, there are tons of hard-edged abstractionists who follow Leon Polk Smith, most famously artists like Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Indiana. But one of the things that gets dropped out of the historical record is that with one exception, and that's Jack Youngerman, every single hard-edged abstractionist was a gay man. And that fact simply hasn't been articulated in the art historical literature, which I think is a real problem. What is it about hard-edged abstraction that appealed to gay men at this period? And the second thing that I wanted to underscore was that Leon Polk Smith's role as essentially the founding figure in this mode, unfortunately, has not been recognized. In fact, Ellsworth Kelly was vastly more famous than he was. And it was a source of real trouble for Leon Polk Smith because he felt rightly that he had inaugurated the style, that in fact, Ellsworth Kelly had ripped him off, but Ellsworth Kelly had been celebrated. And of course, one of the things that also isn't talked about in the art historical record is that the reason that Ellsworth Kelly had the jump on Leon Polk Smith in this regard was that Kelly was dating the director of the Betty Parsons Gallery, which held Kelly's first one-person exhibition after he returned from France in 1956. So Kelly had an in with one of the major galleries and thus had his first one-person show ahead of Leon Polk Smith. So even though Polk Smith was historically the founder, Ellsworth Kelly got deemed the head of the school. And we can see just a little bit sort of some of the animating issues in Kelly's work and compare them to the way Polk Smith handles it. This is a very early self-portrait. You know, here Kelly's a very, very different artist in 1947, much more traditional in his scope than a 1947 work by Leon Polk Smith, who in 1947 is already doing, right, that black and red endless form. But more than that, there's a kind of psychological investment here. You can see him grabbing these sort of bare-rooted plants, holding them, something about fecundity, something about, right, death, something about the impossibility of growth in his hands that, that animates these works. But what's striking is that what Kelly must suggest by animating the paintings on his own nude body, Polk Smith is able to do in the context of the canvas itself. So in 1948, Kelly campily turns his body into a female body by making this painting stand as his midriff, right? But when you see the image segregated from his body, you wouldn't necessarily read it that way. And yet it's precisely these kinds of defining images that run throughout Kelly's career, all the way, as you can see here, from the very earliest Kellys all the way through to this late sculpture, which is about 25 feet tall in Minneapolis. So throughout, Kelly is seeing, and he quite literally attended the first Leon Polk Smith show, he's seeing how Polk Smith makes abstraction stand in for embodiment and carries that, right, in his own work. And unlike some of Leon Polk Smith's work, occasionally Kelly gets a little risque. So Pohl in 1957 plays with, again, sort of like with like forms, this image, right, that seems to suggest an upside down heart. So he starts to suggest forms with which we are already familiar, which have an already existing cultural resonance, which is not something that Leon Polk Smith would do. But this same idea of connecting, of pulling apart, of defining one form in and through its relationship to another, that becomes Ellsworth Kelly's calling card, and by extension, the calling card of all forms of hard-edged abstraction, begins way back in 1938 in Leon Polk Smith's examination of how line is not a thing in itself, but rather the boundary between two things. And the wonderful thing about a boundary line between two things is that it shouldn't be, Polk Smith argues, it shouldn't be understood as the barrier or the boundary between two things. It should be understood instead as the bridge that connects them, that defines their relationship. And thus, in the final analysis, what I'm trying to suggest is that Leon Polk Smith, and by extension, all the hard-edged abstractionists, understand that centrally, this seemingly formal, seemingly geometric, even mathematical form of art making is ultimately about the possibilities of human connection. It's about embodiment and how bodies can touch. And it's a way to analogize forms of desire that in any other historical, formal terms would at this moment be ruled completely out of order, actively illegal. So what Polk Smith manages to do is to find a way to not only articulate his feelings as a gay man, but actually to create paintings that allow us a kind of arena in which we too can enjoy the possibility of these dramas of connection and dissension that constitute the high points of hard-edged abstraction. Thank you. Be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think it really helps both our viewers who have seen the exhibition and those who are completely new to Leon's work to have these insights, because I think, to your point, for so long in a sort of formal art history, the conversation has only really been about formalism. And I even, when you were talking, I always come back to this quote from Andy Warhol, and he's always like, the work is the work and it doesn't mean anything, which of course we all know that that's not true, but really sort of unpacking those layers of something that has that simple reductivity of repeating lines, and really seeing what lies beneath the surface. We do have a couple of questions. The first question is, did Smith himself write or speak about sexual interpretation?
So he never wrote about it, but he did give a series of interviews in which he quoted other people's discussion of his work in sexual terms approvingly. He felt that they understood what he was getting at. And in addition, if one looks at photos that Polk Smith arranged, he often places his own body in proximity to his paintings in a way that suggests a kind of play with erotics and desire. So again, Smith is a product of his moment. By the time gay liberation is coming around, he's a fairly elderly guy. So I wouldn't expect him to embrace this new culture of openness. His instead was always the language of code.
Mhm.
And in terms of the language of code, he was articulate.
Definitely. Another question is there a gay artist whose work follows in Polk Smith's footsteps in your mind, or is a successor to his work and legacy?
Well, Ellsworth Kelly wouldn't like this, but I think of Ellsworth Kelly fundamentally as a successor. I think of Robert Indiana as a successor.
Mhm.
Whenever we see these artists seemingly engaged in hard-edged abstraction, and again, let's define hard-edged abstraction. It means an abstraction in which there is a clear and defined linearity, right?
Mhm.
Those forms of clear and defined linearity have always been understood as enclosing lines.
Mhm.
But what I'm trying to suggest is that they are instead bridge lines. They're ways of connecting one thing to another, and that we, even though we may not be articulate even to ourselves about this, understand these analogically, right, metaphorically, as human drives.
Another question that we have is, can you shed some light on his personal partnership with Robert Jameson?
Yeah, so this is complicated. It's complicated because, well, I might as well just say it. Leon Polk Smith clearly loved Robert. They were together for a very long time, but he didn't treat Robert really well. Robert was a combination of husband and studio assistant,
Mhm.
and maid and cook. And so very clearly the weight in the relationship, the power in the relationship belonged to Leon Polk Smith. And Robert seems contented in his role as the enabler of Polk Smith's artistic legacy.
I guess another question that I have before we move on to a few more from the audience is, in your work on this, on sort of hard edge in general, and linking it to, the fact that you said that all of them except for one were gay men, and the sort of homoeroticism ensconced within the work, that's sort of coded within the work. In writing about this and curating projects about this, have you received pushback from people in the field who are like, no, it's a line is just a line, a form is just a form?
I expected that. And instead, what happened is the Leon Polk Smith Foundation reached out to me and said, oh, finally, somebody got it.
Yeah.
So I felt very validated, actually, by that.
That's wonderful.
And I should say here that in many respects, my experience with the Leon Polk Smith Foundation is very different from my experience with the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, Cy Twombly on, Agnes Martin, all the other artists I've written on. Because almost always, the problem with being an art historian, working on questions of sexuality, is that I am talking about high value commodities and sexuality, and that represents the third rail all the way from the Mapplethorpe show in the 1980s. It's been the third rail, right? Definitely. And nobody likes this. Even though art historically it's rock solid, it's still not liked. Except I think it was really telling that the Leon Polk Smith Foundation said, yeah, we approve of this. And I think in part it is precisely because Leon Polk Smith is, and this is, I think, a terrible injustice, something of a second level artist in the panoply of American arts. He's no Andy Warhol, he's no Robert Rauschenberg. He should be, but he's not. And therefore, the values associated with his work, the money associated with his work, is considerably less. And when the money's less, the problems are less.
Definitely. That sort of inextricable link between art and commodity, it changes the way things are read and the way things are experienced and valued. And to your point during your presentation, do you feel that the sort of moment that Leon's career and trajectory shifted from sort of maybe toward first tier to a second tier was because of Ellsworth Kelly's relationship, and that sort of just usurped that trajectory.
I absolutely do. And the great irony is that Ellsworth Kelly's personal relationship with another man made him the defining hard-edged abstractionist, something that Kelly was at pains to deny almost his entire life, whereas Polk Smith was more than happy to see his work understood in terms of erotics.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely that sort of closeted nature that Kelly battled with throughout his career. And that brings me to another question. Polk Smith and Ellsworth Kelly were both gay artists working at the same time in New York. So if you could maybe elaborate on what we were just talking about, how were their personal experiences similar or dissimilar in the way they navigated both the art world and their personal lives?
Well, by this point, Leon Polk Smith is fully a generation older than Ellsworth Kelly, and Kelly and Robert Indiana, who was then his partner for about 3 years, they live in an area of New York called Coenties Slip, which was basically the old ship warehouse district of Manhattan. They lived in literal cold water flats, no electricity, and you know, they were desperately poor, but the loft spaces, these 19th century warehouses, were enormous. So they used them, Robert Indiana famously, in his own work. What's striking, therefore, is that they live the classic poor artist life. At this point, Leon Polk Smith has been teaching. He's showing, he's not selling for a lot of money, but he's showing. So he's actually a much more established artist. And while he socialized with them, it wasn't a close relationship, in part because after Ellsworth Kelly's meteoric rise, not surprisingly, Smith had a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah.
And I also think that in some ways, the queer cohort of Coenties Slip, and it included not only Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Indiana, but Agnes Martin and her partner, a fiber artist, all of these people living together in this sort of, for want of a better word, queer commune at the base of Manhattan, was not by any means sort of Leon Polk Smith's scene. This communal thing was not his.
Yeah.
So I think he had a tense relationship with them.
Were there any moments where that sort of intensity came to a head? Did Polk Smith ever sort of confront Kelly about the...
If he did, we don't know about it. At least that I don't know about it. It's very clear in his comments and his letters that there's an occasional snideness with regard to Kelly's rise. And one of the things that he immediately understood is that what Kelly most dangerously took from him was this idea of the image as a drama of embodiment. Early Kelly is pure geometric abstraction. You've got black and white lines, or white squares together, orange and white squares together. There's no sense of an organic form within Kelly's early work. That is courtesy of Leon Polk Smith.
And I guess a question for you, not necessarily about the conversation we've been having, but what brought you to his work originally, out of, you know, sort of your career as an emerging art historian and scholar, and what led you to hard-edge abstraction?
I think it's part of a larger interest I have in re-examining the history of American art and trying to understand what was clear to me from the moment I entered grad school but never got talked about, which is why the canon of major American artists and the canon of queer artists are almost exactly the same.
Mhm.
And yet no one talks about questions of sexuality.
Yeah.
We'll go through any list of the great American artists, and the exception is the heterosexually inclined one.
Mhm.
And so what I wanted to understand is why that was the case. And I especially wanted to understand the historical context in which Leon Polk Smith emerges, which is the 1950s, precisely because this is a moment that sees abstract expressionism and its performative masculinity. It's really almost caricatured macho, right? Owning the stage of American history, and yet all around it are these queer artists like Leon Polk Smith engaging in a very different kind of drama.
Definitely. Well, do we have any more questions before we let you go? Again, this has been such a wonderful conversation. And for anyone who hasn't seen the exhibition yet, you have a few more weeks. It has been extended until July 3rd, so you can look at it through a different lens, through fresh eyes after experiencing this conversation.
I see that in the comments someone asked about the name of the artist who was not gay among
Oh,
the
yes.
art abstractionists, and that's Jack Youngerman, who was a very close friend, actually, of Ellsworth Kelly. There's another question. Since Leon Polk Smith never proclaimed or admitted that his abstracts suggest, how do we really know that this is what they meant? Even Georgia O'Keeffe is reported to have said, when it was suggested that her flowers evoke sexuality, sometimes that flower is just a flower. And of course, this is the key question. I would say that there are two ways to know this. Of course, if you want, a clear declarative statement that my painting is about same-sex desire, you're not going to find it. But then again, we wouldn't expect to find it at this historical juncture.
Absolutely.
What you are going to find are the combination of the development of the work, which seems from the very early paintings to the very late paintings to move increasingly towards a notion of not only embodiment, but especially, at least at one key and defining moment, male embodiment, and moreover, the conjunction of like with like. And that is a predominant tendency in the work, so clear as to be inarguable. And then the second thing is that what that tells me a great deal is Polk Smith's citation of other people's interpretation of his work as erotic approvingly. So this tells me that he saw such interpretations as on the right track.
And then we have one question also from David Roche, our director, asking if you can discuss his relationship with Carmen Herrera.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because I don't know much of any contact between the two of them, but obviously there's a great deal of resonance. One of the things that's really striking here, and is actually the subject of an exhibition I'm now working on, is that it seems as if the erotics of hard edge abstraction as defined by gay men transform into a subsequent development of hard-edged abstraction by Latin American and Latinx artists who often use similar forms and resonances of embodiment, but in a very much more political way. I'm thinking of Herrera, I'm thinking of Zilia Sanchez, a number of Cuban artists, a number of Argentine artists, a number of Brazilian artists, Lydia Pape, Lydia Clark, Elio Ipisi, I could go on and on. What all of these artists seem to be doing is playing with the idea of abstraction and embodiment at the historical moment that dictatorships are starting to be felt in Latin America. And so I can't help but draw a kind of analogy between the social and political situation of gay men in 1950s America using encoded language, and a similar development in Latin America accompanying the rise of dictatorships from Cuba all the way to Brazil and Argentina.
One more question that we have is, what are the significance of his color choices? You mentioned showing the gray and orange paper piece. I believe that was rhythm or rhyme, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think he generally sought out descriptive color.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted color to stand separately from the works. The collage works are often painted paper, then cut out and collaged. Sometimes they're colored cardboard or colored paper. But I do think that what he is interested in using color to do is to animate the contrast and the connection between forms.
Wonderful. Well, at this point in the conversation, I'm going to ask Allison to come back online. And again, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and your time. It's really been a treat to hear.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for today's discussion. Again, I also echo Erin's sentiments. Thank you. This is just a wonderfully enlightening discussion and presentation that you had. And again, I always kind of feel like I am back in my art history days, undergrad in the darkroom with the slides, and it's just so fulfilling to hear through that. So thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been such a great discussion. As I mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll have this up on our YouTube channel in about a week. So if anyone needs anything, feel free to just send us an email to the member email, and we'll get right back to you. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend and stay cool, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.